with me, right? There we go. So yes, we're recording from now. Carry on, John. Thank you.
Yeah. So I moved into counselling. I qualified in 1997. I did a couple of years part time working at an FE college, student counselling, and at the same time I was volunteering at the nearest hospice doing bereavement support work. And then a job came up at the hospice after about a year, and I got that job. I was there 17 years. I retired officially in 2017, but I just finished my PhD, and they wanted me to become a visiting fellow of the university, and they wanted me to direct a bereavement service they were just setting up. So I kind of never got around to retiring, basically. My first book came out in 2000, and it was Christmas 2013, and then the second one I'd kind of dreamt about writing it for quite a long time, and I couldn't get a publisher, and I was very angry about that because I knew that it was going to be A, needed, and B, popular. And I couldn't get a publisher, and publishers were saying things like, "Oh, there's not a call for it, and the market is saturated." And no, it's not. So I sat down and I began to write it here and there when I had time. And then COVID came along, and I decided, well, it needs a COVID chapter. So I'd spent a lot of time talking to people who'd lost loved ones from COVID and collecting loads and loads of case studies from them. And one of the differences, I think, from previous work was that if you want to use a case study and you get people's informed consent, most people want to be anonymous. But there was so much anger around COVID losses that people were saying to me, "No, I want you to use my real name, and I want you to use my relative's name as well. I want to kind of immortalize them in print." And that was kind of new to me, that people didn't want to be anonymous. And I've only ever used their first names, but it's unusual to actually use people's real names in roundabout, I don't know, probably about 2/3 of the cases in the book of people's real names, and that was unusual. So, but it's done very well. The publishers were wrong. There was a market for it. I self-published, and that was quite a journey, self-publishing. As Gemma will know, not easy to self-publish a book, and I had loads and loads of support from friends who edited that. That was a great thing, really. That had editors and proofreaders and so on. And I think we're up to something like nearly 2,800, something like that, copies sold so far. So it's done very well. And the great thing about self-publishing is that whereas a traditional publisher will give you about 8% for your first book, 10% if you're known, Amazon 40%. It makes a lot of difference, and it means that I can afford to make the book really cheap. So it's as cheap as I could possibly make it. So there you go. That's me.
Fantastic. Thank you, John. So really, I thought today's format would be slightly different, seeing as we've got John with us. So if we've got questions for him, let's put them to him and see if he can answer them. So I was going to start off because one of my biggest questions was, John, what was your motivation for doing it? Was it to get the information out there to the public, or what was the motivation behind writing it?
I like writing. I enjoy writing. I think I wanted to get something out there that would reassure people, normalise grief. And there's an awful lot of stuff around grief that it's either written from the perspective of somebody that's been bereaved themselves, and so they kind of tell their story. And if you're not careful, if you tell your own story, I think you make the assumption that everybody else's experience of that kind of loss is similar as well. So I was quite keen to write something that was more kind of general, and that also I wanted to include something that included other losses, not just bereavement. I wanted to include stuff around illness, around losing a pet, and so on. And as I said before, I was determined that I would get a publisher, and it would be done that way, and it would be a lot easier to work through a publisher. But then when COVID came along, I realised there was going to be a real desperate need for something. I kind of worked out very early in the pandemic, I was aware this was going to be big, and there were going to be, tens of thousands of deaths. And kind of extrapolating that, I think I worked out around about 4 people on average would be grieving every death as well. And that counselling services, charities would be overwhelmed. So it was quite important for me to get something out there quite fast at that point. And as soon as I got the COVID chapter done, I just worked really hard. Had some fantastic people to proofread it for me. And the cover, I cheated. Because I was so angry with my first publisher. So I thought, well, sod it, I'm going to copy their kind of cover design. If they want to sue me, they can. So I don't know if you've noticed, but the cover is very similar in lots of ways. The colour is different, but the font is the same, and so on. I'm quite determined that it was going to look like a companion to the first one. I've never had any comeback. It's been okay. And then the thing, I mean, you'll have found this, Gemma. It's getting people to know the book is there, isn't it? It's so difficult.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, I'm not doing this for the money, so it's out there to help people. I'm really not doing this for the money at all. So I took a huge gamble and shopped around, read various things around book publicity and people that professional publicists and so on, and I hit on this particular publicist that does things in a very different way to most publicists. And hired them, and it cost an absolute fortune to hire a professional publicist. But it was good, and I think it was kind of what got the book out there in the first place. And I'm not sure it would have been as successful without a publicist. And I've got my money back, but it was an expensive business to publicise a book. I don't know what you're finding, Gemma, but not easy, is it, to get people to know?
No, it's really difficult to and what I found is once the book was available, I had to take a rest before I could promote it. But now, I'm looking at promoting it because I did it when I had time amongst everything else as well, like most people. So
Yeah. It's knowing all the tricks as well to get a book out there, because I think you've already noticed, Gemma, that you write a book and Amazon classify it into a particular group, don't they? So mine is classified within death and bereavement or something like that. But of course, you're up against all the people, all the celebrities that write a book about their experience of loss. Get your book into the Amazon charts, which mine was initially and still is occasionally, but to get it into the top 100, but you have to get so many other books. Not easy.
I watched a video, completely off subject, but I watched a video about a gentleman who knows something about how to publish on Amazon. And he talked about how it's all to do with the algorithm or the system and when you publish. And he managed to get into the top 10 of books that have no content. And he said, this is how you can do it if you just time it right.
right, okay.
I can't remember his name, but it's an interesting video to watch. Yeah.
There are ways of doing it. And the other thing is that you can't, with Amazon, you have to bid to get your book in high in the searches as well.
Right.
People don't know that. I mean, I don't know if you've found that, Gemma, but so I can't remember what I pay now, but I just pay a standing amount each month so that when somebody searches for books on bereavement, then if I've got certain search words that are kind of that I pay
Yeah,
a lot
yeah,
of people. And it's a tough business, but it's that tension between not wanting to make a loss, but getting your book read. It's,
yeah. Definitely.
So I'm going to have to admit I've never read your first book, John. What's I know it's around grief as well, but talk me through that a little bit.
first one was when I started counselling at Guffey's Hospice in Scarborough. It wasn't all that long before they noticed that because I was a qualified teacher and lecturer, that we had a big team of volunteers. So it became important to kind of have somebody that would teach the volunteers. So I got into that part of the job, and then I said I went to my line manager and said, at the time I was only working 3 days a week, and I said, "Is there a way of doing working another day a week just to teach and to research the teaching, but also to bring people into the education centre in the hospice and teach people from outside, like nurses, counsellors, social workers, doctors, receptionists, hospital porters, anybody that's going to be coming into the field and meeting people that are bereaved." And to start with, the hospice management said no, they couldn't afford me for another day a week. And then my boss said to me, "Right, what you need to do, John, is to organise a private event, and if it's successful, you can then come back and show the management here how many people came to listen to you, and you can show them how much you charge per person, and they can do the sums themselves." So I organised an event, and it was incredibly well attended, 30, 40 people, something like that. And it kind of changed the management's mind. So it was fantastic that I was in a job where I was paid 1 day a week to have no clients, but just to read and research. I mean, it was just a fantastic experience in return for teaching outside audiences, either in the daytime or working in the evening. So that was just fantastic. Now, out of that, we were regularly training our own volunteers, and that fell on me. Now there was a resource pack, a sort of loose leaf binder written in 1996, and published by Help the Hospices. It was a really good kind of manual, but it got as years went on, it got more and more out of date. We got to the point where we were using less and less of the manual and putting our own pages in it. So gradually, over several years, we developed our own training pack, and then I came to realise that actually that training pack would make a really good book. That if we could then put the text of the training pack into a book. And so the book, Tom, has got each chapter reflects what we taught on the module.
Oh, excellent.
Validated by York St John University. And at the end of each chapter is sort of notes for trainers as well. So it's kind of written for people to learn themselves about bereavement counselling. It's written for counsellors, teachers, social workers, chaplains, GPs, whatever. But at the end of each chapter, there's notes for people that might want to use it for training purposes, and it is used. It is used in several places for training. So that was the basis of it. I was going to say something else, but it'll come back.
There was something actually I picked up on in your book, which I thought was really interesting. Was you mentioned the 5 stages of grief and how that's not correct.
Yeah.
Do you know, when I did my level 5, which was not that long ago, they still taught that.
I know, and I have regular discussions with people on social media around this. Some time ago, because I quite often get asked to review new books or journal articles and so on, And some time ago, I was asked to peer review somebody that was writing a journal article on not what the gist of the article was. It's time to stop using Kubler-Ross's stages of grief when we're writing textbooks. And this was somebody that was talking about writing textbooks for social work and for counselling and so on. And you know, it's gradually sort of working through the profession that it isn't helpful. That although people do go through different phases, they certainly don't do it in any kind of linear fashion. But one of the problems, well, I see it as a problem with Kubler-Ross, is that she almost worshipped in America. And so I think, I mean, my first book hasn't sold at all in America. I think I've sold about 12 copies in America. And I rather suspect it's because of the criticism of Kubler-Ross in that book.
It's interesting though, isn't it? Because you only have to work with people to realise that that isn't right. I mean, in my experience, in my opinion,
Yeah.
you know.
Well, actually, the state that I mean, again, people often don't know this, but she actually plagiarised the stages from Parks and Bowlby.
Yes.
Colin had gone over to work in Boston. He was doing what was called the Harvard study of American widows, and it was in a hospital in Boston that he first met Kubler-Ross, and he showed her the stages of grief that he and Bowlby had worked on, and then, you know, a few years later, up she pops with the stages of grief that she'd written, and they're very, very similar. And she never credited, never referenced the Bowlby and Park stages. And then it went about 2006, I think it was. Colin had enough of this. He actually published an article to criticise and say this is what happened. And in the same time, he said, you know, and I'm hoping that anybody that does training, anybody that's writing books, will mention this article. And I emailed him and said, you know, I promise you, I will always mention it when I'm training, and I'll always mention it when I'm writing. So, you know, it wasn't fair. No. The other thing that's really important to notice that although Colin Murray Parks and John Bowlby published their stages of grief in various forms, the definitive one is 1970. They published it in a book. But then in 2006, when Colin wrote a book called Love and Loss, he said in there that he discovered in the 1970s that counsellors were using it as a kind of prescription, and they were trying to take clients through it. And he said it was never intended as that they never regarded it as being linear. But most importantly, it wasn't a prescription for working with clients. But I mean, the definitive criticism, the careful criticism of any stage model, but in particular the Kubler-Ross stage, is by Margaret Stoiber and colleagues. And I can't remember the year of that, but you will find that online. That is a very sort of careful dismantling of the sense of using stage models to work with clients.
Yeah. I think, and now you probably correct me, John, but the Kubler-Ross original work was around terminal illness, wasn't it?
Exactly. And it was, I mean, her stages were never intended for working with bereavement. But once people started to see it in that way, that it seems to me that she didn't kind of disabuse them or change their mind or kind of correct that. She just let it happen. And so the myth has built up around using them for grief when, you know, it wasn't grief from bereavement, it was grief from a terminal diagnosis.
Absolutely, which is a different thing. I tell you, one of the things I really did enjoy about your book as well is the fact that you do touch on grief other than just death.
Yeah.
I'm hoping, you've heard it here first, I'm hoping to edit a book. And some of you might be interested in this. You might be interested, Gemma. But I want to write a book I want to edit a book, and I want to get experts in different areas. So I've got somebody already to write about dementia diagnosis, so the grief of being diagnosed with dementia and the grief of the family. Pet loss, I've got somebody who will write a book on losing a dog or a cat or any loved pet. I'm looking for somebody that will write something about life-limiting illness. I think I have somebody in mind, but I think they might be quite ill themselves. I don't know whether or not they'll be able to write it. I think they're getting progressively more and more ill themselves. But I wanted an edited book. It's quite important, I think, to look at that. And I've just started on another book with Professor Lynn Gabriel, my colleague, and we've got a publisher for that one. But that's going to be about working pluralistically with pluralistic counselling for loss and grief. So that's in the pipeline, and we've set ourselves 12 months to write that.
Excellent. That's you answered one of my questions there. Will there be another book? Yes, I guess is the answer to that.
The other one I want to write, whether I will or not, I don't know. But one I want to write is a kind of like popular science book almost on the whole area of loss and grief and counselling and research and so on. And I want to write that in such a way that it's sort of very accessible, very readable, and that people will read that just out of interest, whether they're bereaved or not. Because everybody's bereaved at some point, aren't they? And everybody's got some experience of loss and grief. So I want to write something much more general as well. I much prefer writing an accessible public book like the blue one than writing an academic one. Much prefer it.
And actually, was it you, Victoria, said you recommend John's book to clients?
Yeah.
And I've certainly will as well from now on, because it's so easy to read. It's aimed at the everyday person.
Yeah. And like when I've used it with one client in particular, she did really engage with it, and she used to come back to sessions and she used to pick it up and put it down, pick it up and put it down. But she used to come back to sessions and she said, "Oh, you know, you were talking about such and such. Well, I read it in the book." And then she'd say about, because I think I'd spoken to her about the dual process model, and she went away and read that in the book, and it seemed to join some of the dots for her, and also give her something between sessions because she was really struggling. So it kind of gave her something she could dip in and out of as and when, really.
Somebody, I mean, I smiled when I read it, but somebody that reviewed it on Amazon said it was a simple book. And I smiled at that because it's actually a very complex book written simply.
Yeah.
It's actually my PhD thesis, condensed to 30 easy to read words. So, because my PhD was actually what actually happens in counselling sessions and what happens between them, and how the clients make sense and adapt to their loss. That was really the question, my research question, when I did the PhD. So, although I'd got experience of working with hundreds of clients, the PhD meant that I focused on 10, and it meant that I could transcribe all their sessions, so I could look much more closely. And then I was driving home from counselling at the university one evening, and a program came on Radio 4. I was in the car, and a program came on Radio 4, and it was a program about NHS leaflets. Now, I don't know if you've ever noticed, but if you pick up an NHS leaflet, it's always in fairly big print, but it's also in very, very simple language. So the reading age of an NHS leaflet is around about 10 or 11 years old. So you only need a reading age of 10 or 11 to read it. And if they have to put big words in, then they explain it in brackets. And all NHS leaflets are the same. And I'd kind of been thinking, yeah, that's it. That's how the book's got to be when I sit down and write this. I mean, I'd already kind of written bits of it, but I thought, no, let's start again. Let's make sure. So I try to avoid any word longer than 2 syllables, and I try to avoid long sentences, commas and compound sentences and so on. And if I have to use a big word, then it's in the glossary at the end.
Mhm.
So, and one of the
Yeah.
reasons for that is that if you don't have to do very much bereavement counselling before you realise that one of the, I don't like medicalised words, but one of the symptoms of grief is poor concentration. You can't read a lot of words on a page. And you know, one person that I know that, and I recognised her when she wrote a review on Amazon. I mean, she's a top London lawyer, very, very educated woman. She was bereaved in the pandemic. She lost her mum and her dad within 4 days of each other. And she just couldn't read anything. You know, she had to stop working for a time. But she found she could read that book. So it's not just about making it accessible to everybody. It's also about making it readable when you can't concentrate.
I think that's one of the things I liked in the fact that there wasn't any jargon in it. Because I think the moment you put jargon in something or bigger words, you're kind of then aiming your audience at one particular person, isn't it? Rather than, or a group of people, rather than actually, like you were saying, actually who the book's for. So yeah, I like that. I read it very, very quickly. Where there's some books. There's another grief book that I'm reading at the moment, and it's taking me a long time to read because it's almost like I'm reading one bit, but then I'm needing to kind of really process and think what I've just read. Where this, I read it quite quickly. So yeah, I would say very accessible to anybody, really.
I've been really surprised, Kim, how it's been taken up by counsellors. I didn't think I thought it would be more, you know, just clients, but loads and loads of counsellors have found it really quick. And maybe that's because we're all so busy that we don't have time to read dense text. And that's another reason for wanting to write another one about loss and grief from a more general perspective, and again making that accessible.
I think also I'm going to try and stay on topic here, but I'm just going to go off slightly. I think also there's a little bit of an issue at the moment about trying to make things sound a little bit more medical and using bigger words in some literature to try and, I don't know, tilt the profession maybe slightly. And I like the fact that you've not done that, John.
And I'll continue not to. And actually, when we write the next book with Lynn Gabriel, the next book is, again, it will be accessible. It will use bigger words and it will be academically referenced and so on. But again, I'm hoping we can get the publisher. I don't know whether the publisher has a common referencing style. I'm hoping we can use Vancouver. I don't know if you know the difference between Vancouver and Harvard and APA, but if you use APA or Harvard, every so often you interrupt the line with the name of the author and the date in brackets and so on. And to me, that breaks things up. Whereas Vancouver, you just use a little tiny number, just a superscript number. At the end of the chapter or at the end of the book. And I much prefer that, I think, for this kind of book, this next book. I think that's going to be really important, that we make it kind of flow and make it readable.
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of agree with you on that, to be fair. That's
Also, another bit that I liked is kind of going back to what you were saying about the stages of grief. I like the fact that you would use the kind of, I can't remember the name of the theory, where your grief stays exactly the same size, but you grow around your loss rather than that loss consuming you. That allows then that kind of that space to remember, but to also laugh, to forget, and have a life outside of that as well, but that you're carrying that, but you're not carrying it that it's weighing you down. And I always kind of follow that one, because I always think it kind of works so well with any grief, any loss as well.
Actually, Kim, that of all the kind of theories of grief, that's the one that has got the least academic credibility, and yet it's the one that counsellors and clients like best. It came about because Lois Tonkin, who I've
That's
spoken to
it.
on the phone but never met, unfortunately. We never got a chance to meet. We nearly did, but it didn't happen. She put that together when she was working with a client, and the client's child had been killed. I don't know if it was male or female, and I don't know their age either. And she wouldn't divulge that when I was emailing her. She just kept the client confidentiality. So I don't know whether it was a son or a daughter. Neither do I know how old they were when they died. But she visualized that model working with the client, and then she published it to her students where she was teaching, and it kind of took off internationally. She was really surprised. And she was also amused by the fact that in England we tended to call it the fried egg model, and where she was insisted on calling it the circles model. And we were going to meet. She came over to England because she was in New Zealand. She came over to England, and she was in the south of England, and she emailed me and said, while I'm here, do you want me to come up to Yorkshire and talk to your volunteers? And I said, that'd be fantastic, and it'd be a great chance to meet you. And she said, but, it's a way that the hospice would pay my travel expenses and hotel accommodation and so on. And I couldn't get that past management, unfortunately. So, we never had that opportunity, and we never met. And then I got an email from her that she was caught up in the Christchurch earthquake. So I don't know if you remember, but there was a big earthquake in Christchurch, and she lost her house in that. And then shortly after, she was diagnosed with breast cancer, and she died a couple of years ago now, I think. So really sad that her life became quite tragic towards the end, although she'd worked so hard supporting other people.
I think, Kim, that you're saying about that model, I think it, and John, you saying it has the least academic backing. It feels right, though.
It does, absolutely. I agree. Yeah. It does. And actually, in my first book, there's only one person in that book that isn't anonymous. And I can tell you her story. I can use her name. She would be pleased to know that I was here this morning using her name. The name of the person in the book that I think really epitomizes that circles model is a ex-colleague of mine, friend of mine called Rita. Rita was a social worker specializing in particular in working with young people, adolescents. She was really good at it as well. And she volunteered no, she didn't at the time, but that came later. So at the time she was working as a social worker. Her son, Gary, went out one night with 5 of his mates. And they lived in a village just outside Scarborough. They were going into Scarborough. They came round a bend. Nobody knows what happened, but the car they were in ended up on the wrong side of the road with a head-on collision with somebody else. The person in the other car was seriously injured. Only, I think, one person, one of these young men in the other car survived, and their son Gary was taken to hospital, put on life support, but really there was not much chance of saving him. A lot of it, I think, was about harvesting his organs and so on. And she came for counselling. I didn't work with her. One of my colleagues worked with her. I worked with her husband. But she got really interested then in bereavement sport. She trained as one of our volunteers. And she's one person that I really saw absolutely epitomise that model of somebody whose grief never shrunk, but she grew around that grief. She became a much more compassionate person. She got even better at her job, even better at working with younger men, and she got even better at counselling. She became good at counselling. So, although there's no research, that is the model, that's the example, that, or the case study that I would always say, here's at least one case study that supports that. But I don't think anybody's ever done any research on the model as a whole.
Maybe there's a bit of a gap there for somebody.
There is. There's all sorts of gaps actually, but research is so difficult. You know, in terms of organisation and ethics and getting people's informed consent. I mean, you know, it was a real struggle to get 10 people to volunteer for my PhD. Real struggle. Would have liked double that, but couldn't get them.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think as a society in the West, I don't think we deal with grief well.
No.
When you kind of look at, I think it was on a, quite bizarrely, if anybody's ever seen the series 6 Feet Under, it's quite an old series, and it's kind of set in a funeral director's home, and it obviously it tackles grief. It features in every single episode, but there was one where one of them is talking about the difference between kind of how kind of grief is seen in the fact of almost quite a clinical way of, like, say for example, a funeral, that, you know, you take the body is taken to the mortuary and then taken to the funeral directors, and it's prepared, and you know, it's embalmed, and particularly in America where they can view, kind of, it's less so probably here in this country, and just how different it was when they kind of went to another country where it was the whole thing that the family dressed the body, the family cleaned the body was in the family's home for a period of time. They dug the grave, they filled the grave, they, you know, they cried, they pounded the earth, all of those things. And it was like their grief was seen and felt in those moments, where it's almost like that, I don't know, it's just seen very, very differently, I think, in the West. And it's almost quite this detachment, or almost that, oh, well, you've had your time now, you should be feeling better now, or you ought to be feeling better now, or you've had the funeral, therefore it's your opportunity to say goodbye, and all of these things. And yeah, I just think we've kind of lost it. We've lost that part in some, you know, not obviously you get individuals, I'm not saying kind of as a whole, but I think, yeah, we've lost touch with things.
I think you're right, Kim. And actually, something that I work on in sessions sometimes when I talk to people about that kind of thing, and how, excuse me, as a Western society, it's a little bit strange that actually we give the body over to strangers to take care of and look after.
Yeah.
There's a lovely book, can't remember what the book's called, but it's an edited book. One of the chapters in it is called Death in Staithes. The Staithes is just north of Whitby on the coast, and I used to live there for a few years, and it's an interesting account of how people funerals and death in the village, in the fishing village in the 1950s, and we've lost all that. You know, that when somebody in the village died, the laying out board was propped behind the co-op. People knew where to go and fetch it, and the laying out board would be brought into the cottage where the person had died. It would be put across 2 chairs because the cottages were so small. So the laying out board would be put between 2 chairs, and then the body would be put on the laying out board, and women of the village and the family would wash and prepare the body and dress it, and then everybody in the village would come and visit and eulogize over the body, tell funny stories and so on. And then the funeral would only be only the men would go to the funeral. The women would stay at home, and I'm told that was the custom in lots of places in England. It was the custom in Wales, for example.
Actually, a client of mine showed me an article regarding the treatment of bodies in a different culture. And forgive me, I can't remember where it is. But actually, what they did once a year was dig the body up, and they dress it and sit with it.
Yeah.
Oh,
It's obviously so strange in our way of life, but to them, perfectly normal, and actually seems to bring them quite a lot of comfort because it still means that the individual is part of the family.
yeah.
Can't
Is
remember which, sorry, Kim.
No. Honestly, go on.
In part of Indonesia, there's a tribe in Indonesia where when the person dies, they don't regard them as dead until the burial. So they're in bed when they have died biologically, but they're in bed and people still go and talk to them, take them food, and so on, wash them, look after them, and so there's a kind of extended period of death because they don't regard the person as dead until the actual day of the funeral. I wrote an article for there's a magazine, an online magazine called The Conversation. If you go online and just put theconversation.com and then put my name into it as a search, and fairly recently I wrote an article about deaths in different places across the world, deaths and ceremonies and rituals. You have to put my middle name in, but because there's so many John Wilsons in this world. Put John Frederick Wilson in, and you'll find all the articles I've written for that magazine.
Do you really? I don't know if this is not really a personal question, but you can take it either way. Do you find that people's beliefs and religious beliefs and faiths change the way they grieve?
Do you know, I envy people with a faith because it makes so much difference.
Yeah.
At the moment, I'm working with Lynn Gabriel. We run a support group on a Tuesday evening for people bereaved by COVID. This is the fourth one we've run. The other three have all been time limited, closed groups, 10 sessions. But as part of our research, this one is open ended. So it's an open group and it's open for a year. So people can leave and join in that space of time. It's not worked out like that because people don't want to leave, they want to stay the full year. So there's very few places have come up for people to join. But there are people in there. We've had in our groups, we've had Hindus, we've had Christians, we've had Jews in the group. Not had any Muslims in the group, but that's probably significant. But it is really interesting how bereavement shakes people's faith. But if they can still hang on to that faith, what a comfort it is. I think it's really, really important when we're working with people to explore not just their faith, but their spirituality as well.
Yeah, that was kind of a loaded question on my part because I've experienced that with client work. I'm an atheist, I'm happy to admit that, so I have no faith of my own, but I find that people that have a faith grieve significantly differently.
Yeah. I find a really useful question to ask at assessment is, where do you think your loved one is now? And you get kind of three kind of answers. So you get a religious answer, which is kind of like an afterlife, and you get people say in my heart, or they'll say that they're in my memories or whatever. So you get a real handle on how people are managing their grief with that question.
There's a quote, and I can't remember who it's by, but it says something like, "We all die 3 times. So the time we actually die, the last time somebody speaks our name, and the last person that remembers us."
Yeah.
I worked with somebody that was in a real dilemma. He had been a lifelong atheist, and his wife had been a lifelong atheist. And I don't know why it was so important to her, but when she was dying, she made him promise that he wouldn't start thinking that she was somewhere, in heaven or whatever, which I thought was very unfair. But anyway, so he was in a real dilemma because he just couldn't. He needed to think of her as somewhere, and actually, part of the counselling was kind of exploring the kind of nature of of science, and the idea that we've all got molecules in us that once belonged to Einstein and Shakespeare.
Yeah.
That we're constantly being recycled. The water that we drink has been, drunk thousands of times by other people, and it will have part of their cycle of life model that he kind of developed, and that way he could see his wife as kind of living on in atoms and molecules, and that was what he needed. That was okay. So I think sometimes we're not just working with people's faith; we're working with a lack of faith. And,
Yes.
I'm not in any way religious. I'm spiritual, but I choose to believe that my mum and dad are looking down on me. I know they're not. I know they're not logically, but it's lovely to believe that I can have that kind of fantasy.
Yeah, that's interesting. That because I said I'm an atheist, but really that's not necessarily true. Because I'm not religious in any way, and I wouldn't say that I'm spiritual. But that doesn't mean that I disregard any possibility that there may be something else.
Yeah.
I once, quite a while ago, worked with a client who was raised in a religious family, but then became an atheist. And this individual said to me it was quite traumatic, actually, because they had to lose everybody again. And that was one that always sticks with me, because I was like, yeah, that's quite a valid point there.
Yeah.
One of the difficult bereavements that I worked with was somebody that was a Jehovah's Witness, and their daughter had renounced the witnesses so that he believed that she would be permanently in hell. And he found that really difficult, that she would never be saved, that come the great, whatever they call it, great destruction of the earth, where only Jehovah's Witnesses will be saved on the new earth. That she wouldn't be there, so he'd lose his daughter. He'd lost her to death, but he'd never ever be reunited with her. They found that was really difficult, and then, of course, there's nothing I could do about that, because there's no way of shaking that fact.
Yeah, it is interesting, isn't it? Because as much as faith sometimes is a comfort for people, I think you're absolutely right. Sometimes it causes other complications within the grief.
Yeah.
Yeah, I worked with an elderly gentleman. Having said that, when I look back and think of him as an elderly gentleman, he's only 2 years older than I am now. But he was quite infirm, which I'm not. He's quite frail, and he visited his wife's grave every morning and every night in the local cemetery, in the local graveyard, and it was in danger, on icy paving slabs in the churchyard. He was in real danger of falling in the early hours with nobody around, and it was really dangerous for him. But we were trying to persuade him that he didn't need to do that very often, and that he needed to, keep himself safe. But somebody in his church congregation told him that he ought to stop doing it, because he was stopping his wife going to heaven. That she was in limbo until he stopped hanging on to her so much. And really, really cruel. I mean, it was just sort of some kind of quasi-religious interpretation that certainly the clergy wouldn't have supported. But again, I think you're right, Tom. I think sometimes religion can be a real millstone for some people.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely. And the other part, actually, in your book that is really interesting, and I never considered it, because you talk about the language used around death. And even as a professional, in everyday life, I still find myself using some of those terms. And I thought, do you know what? That's really interesting. And I'm actually going to look at that myself, because obviously not in the therapy room, then it's different. But outside the therapy room, I've still found myself sometimes, if not using them, at least thinking them. And I was like, oh, that's interesting.
Actually, this last week, one of my colleagues has questioned that. One of the big movements within our university and with our kind of research area is around decolonisation. And my colleague is a PhD student, kind of looking at culture and grief, is saying, actually, the phrase "passed away," which we might find a euphemism, is important in some religions because their understanding of death is very different in some religions. So, for example, in the African religions, they talk about the people not being like the undead, they're kind of the living dead. I think that's the phrase they use. So that their kind of spirit still walks the earth. So in one sense, they're not dead because their spirit, rather than being in heaven, the spirit is on earth. So they kind of go on as a living dead.
It's interesting, isn't it? I have to go shortly. But yeah, it's interesting, like language, because particularly with children, often that can complicate things where people will say they've gone to sleep, they've passed away. And when you break it down, it's like, what does that actually mean? Because like I always say with children, they don't have the emotional, they don't have the emotional baggage as a lot of adults have. And their experiences are new. So it's almost like we have to tell them the facts before they're able to then process things, to make sense of things. So say, for example, like if you don't, then they tend to fill in the gaps that can be 10 times worse than the reality of it. A funny story was when my gran died, my son was 4 at the time. And we were completely open and honest with him. He came to the funeral, but before the funeral, he came in our bed, like each morning where he used to, and we were saying, oh, you know, great gran will, you know, she'll go into like a coffin, but it will be a wicker basket. And he's going, what's a wicker basket? And we're going, wow, okay, how do we explain this one? And we were like, well, you know, the basket that we've got near the fire, it's a little bit like that, the wicker, that's what it's kind of made of. And he was like, you could see him kind of processing it. And it wasn't until about a few days later, came snuggling in our bed again, and he goes, how are they going to fit great gran into a basket? And it just suddenly made me chuckle, because she would have thought it would be funny. And I just had this vision of him probably thinking that we were going to shove great gran into this basket with a leg sticking out or something. And it was like, oh, do you mean the same size as the basket by the fire? And he was like, yeah. Oh no, it's going to be a lot bigger. So when it got to the funeral, he was able to see it and then understand it and process it. But we had a bit of a chuckle because it was like, again, through the eyes of a child, what does that actually mean? I have to go. I'm really, really sorry. But yeah.
Okay, nice to see you, and we'll maybe see you in the next one.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much.
Take care. Bye.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
I remember when my son died, one of the things that we were determined that was that there were not going to be any kind of euphemism on his headstone. And I remember, and also in the kind of funeral announcement as well in the paper, and the undertaker saying, what wording do you want? And we said, well, we just want Paul Wilson died 2nd of December 1982. And he said, you want died in it? Yes, we want died. He has died. We don't want fell asleep or passed away or gone to Jesus or any of that stuff, you know. So, and it's on his headstone as well. So it says, you know, died, which is quite unusual, I think, to pretend not to put that on a child's gravestone. I
think people tend not to use that word at all. I think people are fearful of it in many ways. And a story that actually both of those have just made me think of, and it's slightly different, is I've got a friend who is agnostic at best. And 2 years ago, we lost one of our dogs, and his little girl was very close to it. They were actually neighbours of ours. And the dog was old. She had a great life. She was 15. And instead of saying that the dog was dead, he told her that the dog had gone to heaven. And I had a discussion with him. I said, well, why have you said that? He said, because it's easier for her to come to terms with it. Now, I'm not a parent. I've never wanted to be a parent, but it always fascinates me that, because it's like, well, is that comforting lie? Is that helpful?
Not sure. I'm not
No.
sure.
And it's interesting because I work with people with autism, so you have to be straight. So it is died, and it's not passed away or gone to sleep, and they're actually quite brutal. Some people with autism in the use of language. So yeah, because I remember I am quite straightforward in my language, I suppose, because of that experience. And some of my relatives were like, "Oh, you shouldn't." I said, "Well, that's what's happened." Because the other thing is, I do work with children, and I do remember having one child come to me because they were scared to go to sleep because they thought they were going to not wake up. You know, like this other person that had recently died and been told that they'd gone to sleep. So yeah, I can resonate with that use of language.
Was that John? Was that what the loss of your son? Was that what changed your career path into this?
That time, because I've kind of people ask me a lot, and I kind of sort of I've explored it myself. I mean, Paul died in 1982, and I didn't move into counselling. I didn't even think about counselling training until well, would have started around about 1994, wouldn't it? 3 years. And on the diploma course, I think it was, not certificate course, we had to kind of look at a particular kind of death, and I chose got death to look at. And I got really, really tearful kind of writing that and presenting to the group and so on. But I don't know. I don't think so. I think, unless it was something really sort of subconscious. But one of the things it has made, from a professional point of view, it has made me sometimes quite reactive against. Yeah, that's a strong word, but I think I'll stick with it. It's made me really reactive against people that write a book about a particular kind of loss based on their own loss, because it's almost making that assumption that I grieve like this, therefore it would help you if I tell you to grieve the same way. And it's been, I mean, I would never dream of writing a book about cot death.
No.
Because, and I have the same problem with for people that write books about suicide, because I have never, I mean, I've worked with many people that have been bereaved by suicide. I've never met anybody that does their grief is in the same pattern. That they can be very, very different. I've even worked with people that have lost a son to suicide and not needed counselling. That one assessment has kind of reassured them. And I've worked with people where they've been bereaved by suicide, but that isn't the main focus of their counselling.
Yeah.
So I think it's really, really difficult, and I've got quite a lot of opposition to sort of books that are based on, you know, bereaved in a certain way or whatever, you know.
I actually, that's interesting. I've done a lot of work with people that have been bereaved by suicide as well, and I completely agree. Everyone is very different. And actually, I worked with a gentleman only for a couple of sessions who had lost his wife to suicide, but he didn't need therapy. He was okay. He was managing that loss. Interestingly, I had another client who identified with an individual who wrote a book very much along what you're saying. They were, now what's it called? The Motherless Daughters. Has anybody ever come across that? Okay.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think I've got that book actually.
Okay, well, this client so identified with that book that she couldn't allow herself to grieve, because this individual that had written that book identified as a motherless daughter, and that was how she made her whole career out of it. And as once we got through that and we worked through it, she's like, "Oh, that's why I'm not allowing myself to process some of this." I was like, "Yeah, because you're using that as an identity."
Yeah.
I rather suspect that's really been helpful, because I rather suspect that I'm working with people at the moment that are identifying with losing a partner from what they've read and are kind of using that as a kind of framework. And in fact, that's really important, because I will address that.
Yeah,
in the support group.
I think it is important, and the reason I think maybe I'm passionate about that is I lost my mother when I was young, but I don't identify as a motherless child. I mean, that I'm just somebody who lost a parent. Everybody loses a parent eventually, and both of them eventually, you know.
I mean, again, this kind of discussion is so important because there was an occasion when I was invited to go and speak at a cot death group in Leeds, and I've been on the telly to talk about it as well on one occasion. But when I got to this meeting, one of the first things I felt when they were kind of doing their kind of they're having their their monthly meeting and talking about fundraising and this and that this was a group full of people, some of whom that the loss of their child was years and years behind them, but they identified as bereaved parents.
Yes.
And I do think people can maybe hold themselves back if they identify from that perspective.
Yeah, I think you have to be careful, don't you, between using it as a catalyst to make a change,
yeah,
and actually holding on to it and identifying with it, and they're two very different things, and people don't always realise that. So we're just about out of time, unless anybody's got any burning questions for John. No. The last question I have for you then, John, is your cat still with us? You mentioned she was 21 years old, wasn't she, when you wrote the book?
She's not. She got more and more ill, and she kept going. We took her to the vet to see what the problem was, and apparently she got terrible toothache. So the vet said, "Well, take all the teeth out," and she may die under the anaesthetic, but if she doesn't, she'll be a much happier cat. And so, what do you want to do? We said, well, if we can have her put to sleep, or you can put her on the anaesthetic, she can have her teeth done. If she comes around from the anaesthetic, then that's great. You know, she's going to now be pain-free and have a much happier life. And that's the chance we took. And the vet was amazed. I mean, she was 20, that was after the year after the book was published. So she was by then 22. And she came out of the anaesthetic and she was a much happier cat. But then she gradually went downhill just through just age, really. And I've got a picture here, actually. A very kind friend. Not a very good picture because she's looking so moth-eaten, but a very kind friend. So, yeah, that's the last time she woke me up in the morning. So she summoned the energy to wake me up to have her breakfast, but she couldn't eat. She just wanted to wake me up, really. And she couldn't eat, and within 24 hours, we'd taken her to the vet to be put to sleep after that picture. But yeah. Yeah, so thanks for asking. Yeah, but she had a good life and got a peaceful death. And even in the pandemic, the vet found ways of allowing, with a long catheter lead, you could hold the cat and the vet could stand back. It was very clever sort of thinking out social distancing, but allowing owners to be there when the pet was put to sleep.
Yeah.
I think that's another part of the COVID pandemic and losing pets. I lost my cat last year, not in the pandemic, but I know the impact it has on people. And I also know, because I'm part of a lot of cat groups and things, that people had to go through that experience in the pandemic, where in the early stages, in that real panic, hysteria, like what is going on, the vets wouldn't even let them in. Over time, they did offer ways, like you said, and that's another thing that affected people in the pandemic, and that horrendous sense of loss.
Completely unrelated, but I noticed I corrected myself about cemetery and graveyard. Do you know the difference between a cemetery and a graveyard?
No, not off the top of my head. Go on.
Graveyard is always part of a church, part of church land.
Ah, okay.
A cemetery is a public, a public space.
Yes.
So, like in our village, our small market town, there's a graveyard, and next to the graveyard is a cemetery. You just go through a gate, and then you're in the cemetery. But a graveyard is always church. Cemetery is not on church land.
Oh, well, there you go. I have a very last quick story I'll tell you. I don't know if anybody's ever read the book. I think it's called Happy by Darren Brown. You know, the illusionist. His
I
Yeah.
went to see him on Friday night.
Did you? Very good, isn't he? I've seen him a couple of times.
Yeah, and funnily enough, his show is there's a lot of bereavement links in it. His latest show, it's going to be on TV, I think.
I've seen it. He lost his dad, didn't he, during the pandemic?
He
Yeah,
did.
yeah. So he's got a lot into philosophy and ways of living of late, and he writes a few books on it. And he met a lady at one of his shows who has terminal cancer, and she was so upbeat about the way she faced it and everything. He stayed friends with her, and she said, "Well, if you're near where I live and doing a show, please come and see me for a cup of tea." And he did. Now, but he doesn't drive, so he always gets his friends to drop him off, or he has a chauffeur or whatever. But at this particular thing, he arranged for his mate to pick him up, and he said he was sat there talking to this lady, and he said his friend's a little bit kooky. He said, and he lives in an old converted church. He also drives a hearse. And he said, I was sat there talking to this woman, and I suddenly realised that he might turn up to pick me up in a hearse. Fortunately, he didn't, but he said the terror that she found it hilarious when he finally confessed why he'd got all panicky. He said the fear that he suddenly realised what might happen. So there we go. Right, shall we leave it there for today?
Yeah. Yeah.
Item, mate. It's been really interesting.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for coming, John.
So much, can't we?
Yeah. That's it. And I think that's what we found with these groups, haven't we? Although we base them around the books that we're reading, we tend to go off and wander off onto various subjects and discuss all kinds of things. And it's nice to have peer support, isn't it? Because, you know, what we do for a living can be quite lonely sometimes.
Yeah, yeah. Good luck with the book, Gemma.
Yeah, thank you.
Is it selling
Yeah, I found the group really interesting. Yeah.
Is it selling okay?
Yeah, he's not doing too bad, but it's the promotion of it that's challenging. But yeah.
Gemma, remind me what it was called again?
It's called How to Build Your Business Piece by Piece, the Diary of a Disabled Entrepreneur.
I shall publicise it in the group for you, see if we can get you at least a couple more sales.
Right.
Okay, then. Thank you very much.
Well,
So, is it sort of this time at the end of the month every time then?
It is at the moment, so it's either 10:30 or 6 p.m. at the moment on the Monday that's closest to the end of the month. I am trying to work out other dates, but at the moment it's trying to find a place in my diary where I can actually get them in. But
Right.
I'm more than happy for anybody to arrange one in the group, you know, if they want to, and just arrange your own meetup. That's absolutely fine. Doesn't matter. Okay.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much.
Right. Nice to speak to you all.
Nice to meet you all. Bye.
Bye.